Hello, I'm delighted as the Chief Probation Officer for England and Wales to be asked today by the CEP to offer my reflections on leadership and leading through challenging times. I guess for all of us, we've had to lead our probation services in whatever jurisdiction through an international crisis. So the topic for today is very timely, and I hope that my reflections chime and inform with your experiences over the last 2 years. So, as I said, I'm Sonia Flynn. I'm the Chief Probation Officer in Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. I've been in the probation service a long time now. In fact, I joined in 1988, based in London, and I've worked in a variety of roles, both in courts, community and prison. During my career, I've taken the opportunity to work in other locations. I worked for central government for a while, as it says there, for the Home Office. And in 2008, I secured my first senior role in probation. In 2017, I secured the role as Chief Probation Officer. Moving on to the next slide. So this slide gives you a current picture of our new unified probation service. As I'm sure many of you are aware, and I'm going to touch on this in more detail, in 2014, the probation service in England and Wales was subject to a major policy review. And as a consequence, the service, with its long history dating back over 100 years, was actually separated, divided. Half of the probation service was retained in public ownership, and half of the probation service, that which supervised low and medium offenders, was actually put to the market and then divided into contracts and delivered primarily by the private sector. However, in July of this year, our proud probation service was put back together. So what this map shows you now are the 11 regions in England, and each colour is a region, and you can see that laid out there, and of course Wales. I thought it might be helpful to give you some stats on the side so you can see how many senior probation officers we have located across the country, probation officers, the number of people that we currently supervise on probation, you can see there, and finally, and most importantly of all, the number of face-to-face interviews we conducted in August 2021, which was 96,000. For me, that's a really important figure because obviously in August of this year, the restrictions in England and Wales had been largely lifted. So for me, that figure is a symbol of our recovery from the pandemic and that we were able once again to see people in person, not just by telephone or through a video link. So there we are, that is the current probation service, but I'm going to look back a bit now and just reflect on some of the major challenges that have surrounded us in recent years, from unification to dealing with a pandemic, and actually how do we secure our ambition for the probation service in the future. Next slide, please. So I reference this, as I say, I've been around the probation service a long time, and the Transforming Rehabilitation event, which happened in 2014, was, I can honestly say, one of the most significant changes in probation in its long history. The purpose of Transforming Rehabilitation was the government's initiative to reduce reoffending. It was judged that actually, if the probation service was separated, that there would be better outcomes achieved. So as I set out earlier, and as it states on the slide, the service was divided in two. There was the National Probation Service, which dealt with the most highest risk and serious offenders. So predominantly the new National Probation Service, as it was in 2014, took all the offenders who had been convicted of the most serious sexual and violent crime. And as you can imagine, most of those individuals were being released from prison on post-release licence. So effectively we became a parole service, a service which supervised people after they were released from prison. We did, however, retain responsibility for services to court, and it was the National Probation Service with its officers in court that gave advice to judges and about how people should be sentenced. So there were two elements to the service: post-release licence and supervising and giving advice to courts. Now, the newly formed community rehabilitation companies, or CRCs as they were called, were largely run by the private sector, but often in collaboration with third sector organisations. And they took responsibility for all of the low and medium risk offenders. So those individuals that generally would be made subject to a community order from court, or they might receive a short period of custody. This also meant that the community rehabilitation companies, the CRCs, were running all of unpaid work and most of our treatment programme provision. So you can see there that separation. Over time, however, what was found was that the government's ambition that this would be a more effective delivery of probation was not in fact realised. It was generally judged to be overcomplicated. And the National Audit Office, in fact, in 2019 completed a review in which it judged that it did not believe the programmes and its outcomes provided value for money or enhanced the aims of reducing reoffending. Now, that National Audit Office report was very important because what this did was it prompted a review by government. Next slide, please. So, as you see, a consultation actually started in 2018 because there was a growing body of evidence that transforming rehabilitation had actually destabilised some of probation practice, and that there needed to be greater unification. So the Audit Office report and this growing body of evidence as set out here actually resulted in May 2019 the announcement that offender management would be returned to public ownership. And actually that process started earlier in Wales in December 2019. And then later, in June 2020, it was decided that actually everything should be returned to public ownership. That included unpaid work and also interventions and treatments programmes. So with those decisions having been made incrementally, as you can see there, the date was set for the 25th of June 2021 when unification would happen. Next slide, please. However, what none of us could have expected once the announcement was made in 2019 that unification would be our goal by the 25th of June 2020, what none of us could have imagined was that there would be a national pandemic. And as I'm sure you're all aware, and it's a day that I will never forget, on the 23rd of March in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister addressed the nation and announced a national lockdown. I'm sure in your own jurisdictions, your own countries, you have the same memory. So on the 23rd of March, everyone was instructed to stay at home. With the exception of those services which were designated as key services and their staff designated as key workers. So those public services where it was judged that if they were to shut or close, that would present serious risk to the people of the United Kingdom. And within that mix of staff that were designated as essential or key workers was the probation service. So along with our National Health Service, the police, and the teaching profession, it was judged that, and people who deliver the post and people who work in supermarkets, we were the group of individuals that must continue to deliver our services. It was, and I guess it feels somewhat understated to say, an exceptional time. I, along with my senior team, so the regional probation directors in the regions across England and Wales, and within my own exec team and the Director General and the Chief Executive of Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, will then set the most significant challenge to think about how we would continue to deliver probation services in this environment. And what this slide actually sets out are the key decisions that we made to ensure that we could continue to protect the public and reduce reoffending and offer services to the courts. The way in which we did this was at an early point. By April 2020, was we had developed our exceptional delivery model for all aspects of probation. Basically, that set out what things we were going to continue to do and what things we would stop. Importantly, the things that we continued and decided we would continue doing was to offer face-to-face contact to the most high-risk offenders, those individuals that we felt if we did not continue to see them in our offices, that would present significant risk. For everyone else, we put them onto either telephone reporting or using video contact if that was possible. We also set up agreements with our courts that we would continue to offer advice to courts, but that would largely be done remotely through video link. The same in terms of our advice to the parole board, so that people could continue to be released from prison if they were subject to parole. And again, that was done through video links. We also set up arrangements with other local partner groups, and within most locations, the criminal justice agencies came together, so courts, prosecution, the police, so that we had the leadership together coordinating in this during this exceptional period. Not only did we have leadership groups operating at local levels, but we set up our Probation Gold Command to oversee the delivery of the service, and that was then supported by Silver and Bronze Command in the probation regions. So with the Director General and myself and other executive colleagues, we would initially meet daily through the early period to ensure that the decisions that we made, that they were discharged correctly, and that we had the infrastructure to receive information up the organisation and issue information down the organisation very quickly. This was quite a change for probation, and I guess in organisations like the police or the fire service, certainly in the UK, they're more familiar with this direct control and command kind of culture. That wasn't really probation culture. We're a bit more reflective, shall I say. So it was a change to have this very definite command structure introduced from April 2020. We also relied heavily on the service, as noted in the third bullet point there, to adapt its approach to delivery and to harness technology where possible for both staff and people on probation. We recognised that we, for the first time, would have to start issuing phones to those that we supervised if they didn't have a phone, because otherwise, how could we contact them? We also recognised that a lot of our meetings that used to happen face to face, either within the organisation or with our key partners, would now have to happen on Teams. But fortunately, in England and Wales, we had in 2019 actually reissued all our probation officers and probation staff with laptops and with iPhones. So we were probably in a better position maybe than some. However, we've never exploited it in the way that we had to in 2020 to keep the service running. One of the key aims of government as we stepped into lockdown was to mitigate the risk of infection amongst the general population. And one group that were particularly vulnerable were those who are street homeless. And sadly, in many of the cities and towns across England and Wales, there were people who are street homeless. So our contribution to the government's initiative to actually take people off the streets and give them somewhere to live was that we set up our homeless prevention teams, working in collaboration with other housing providers to ensure that when people came out from prison, that they were not street homeless. Ironically, for many, many years, the probation service has called for more resource and ability to avoid people being homeless, either on a community order or indeed when they're released from custody. So out of this crisis came an opportunity actually to resolve one of the long-running issues in terms of our ability to properly support people when they are released from prison. And finally, as indicated on this slide, we introduced a recovery programme. Whilst we had clearly understood and deployed an exceptional delivery model to take us into the pandemic, we needed a mechanism to take us out once some of the lockdown restrictions were eased. So we set up a recovery programme that was matched to the government's recovery steps. So as it was decided by Public Health in the United Kingdom, stages when people could return to the office, when our shops reopened, when our pubs reopened, we followed the same steps of recovery in terms of when we made decisions when people could come back to the office more, when we would start offering face-to-face contact to individuals beyond just the high-risk offenders. So the exceptional delivery model was important in taking us in. The recovery programme was equally important in leading us out of the national crisis. So these are all the things which, on reflection, I believe have actually served us well, and we've learned so much through this process. Next slide, please. So I've touched on some of this, but these are some of the things that we had to also undertake. So you can cut that bit. So I've described the learning from the pandemic and the challenges that we had to deal with during 2020. But we had another challenge running in parallel, because as I mentioned previously, in 2019, the decision was made to put the probation service back together. We had a hard deadline, the 25th of June. That's when the contracts for the CRCs ran out. We couldn't postpone, we couldn't delay. So whilst we were dealing with the pandemic in the way that I've just described, we had our Probation Unification programme running, that we maintained and kept fully staffed to ensure that we would hit that 25th of June deadline. We had 8,000 staff being returned from the Community Rehabilitation Company, and all the processes of actually changing their conditions of employment. During that time, the programme delivered 16,000 new laptops and phones to the staff joining the new organisation. And we had to re-procure 110 contracts at the value of £200 million, so that we had services to offer those we supervised from day one. Important services like interventions for women, employment and training services. We had to go back out to the market because we were shutting the other contracts down so that we could have that ready for day one. But you know what? We did it. And I think we did it because we retained that strong programme focus during the unification. We had a dedicated group of staff. That was their job to get us to unification, and we didn't muddle their world with the leadership required down through our exceptional delivery model and our recovery programme. So it was that distance, the space to allow the operations to continue in the pandemic environment, but allowing the programme to ensure that we would get to the 25th of July successfully, which we did. Next slide, please. So we had our unification programme, and that was successful and important, but we also have been running another programme alongside, because what we recognise is that unification is not the end of our journey, it's the beginning. And actually over the last few years, what we have witnessed has been a reduction in the number of trained and qualified probation officers in the probation service. So in preparation for unification, we have stood up a workforce programme to secure the highest number of new recruits into the service ever seen. And this slide actually sets out the purpose of that workforce programme. But because probation is only as good as the professionals that work within it, our probation officers are our lifeline. So the workforce programme has a number of key strands. The first one is to develop greater access and opportunity and diversity in terms of the new recruits we want to bring in. We've recognised for too long, too many probation officers are women and they're white, which does not reflect our caseload. So we want greater diversity. We want more people from Black and Asian minority groups joining the probation service. We want people who maybe have had more life experience. This could be their second career. So one aim of the workforce programme, yes, to increase the numbers, but also to increase the range of people coming in. We have a clear retention and recruitment strategy to increase the numbers. Within the programme, a new learning and development delivery model to skill up our staff. We're working hard, as it says there, on professional recognition and ultimately to see if we can secure professional registration for probation officers in England and Wales. And when we do recruit the new staff, we want to ensure that everyone has manageable and balanced workloads, because the level of vacancy and the shortage of probation officers has put a heavy demand on our service, and we've seen that impact on the quality sometimes of casework. Historically, we've recruited 600 trainee probation officers per year. However, as a result of our workforce strategy, we're committed to recruiting 1,000 trainee probation officers by January 2021, which we achieved. And we're increasing our levels of recruitment even further than this in 21 and 22 to 1,500 trainee probation officers. And we estimate by 2025 we should have filled that gap that we know currently exists in terms of qualified probation officers. Next slide, please. So I've explained how we have stood up our new unified service, how we did that in a pandemic, and also how we're trying to strengthen and improve the quality of our supervision through our workforce programme. But we have other opportunities now, and these are laid out on this slide. I think as a consequence of the way in which we responded to the pandemic, we actually gained a lot of respect across government and have been recognised for the important work that we do. So as a result of that, we have actually secured additional money from government to invest in our probation services. And this slide sets out that investment that will happen over the next 3 years. So we've received an additional 183 million to our budget as set out in the first slide. And that will also support the anticipated increase we think there's going to be in our caseload in the years to come. We have secured additional funding for the alcohol abstinence monitoring requirements and acquisitive crime project. This was launched in 6 Pathfinder police forces and has now been expanded to 13 police forces in September 2021. In effect, this has given us the authority to make alcohol abstinence bracelets a requirement of a court order. The bracelets are worn on the wrist and they record if somebody has chosen to drink alcohol, because the requirement of the court, if they accept to wear the bracelet, is that they must be abstinent from alcohol for 12 weeks. And the research shows that that period of abstinence can have lasting change with people who particularly are binge drinkers. The bracelet isn't suitable for those with very entrenched dependency and they require other intervention. We're also starting to introduce the wearing of the bracelet next year for people when they are released from prison and they are subject to a licence. Just a point of clarification, if you think the Chief Probation Officer's wearing an alcohol abstinence bracelet, I'm not. That's my steps counter to try and keep me fit. So, but the bracelet does look something like that. Moving us on to our next investment opportunity. As a result of the work that we did during the pandemic to set up the homeless prevention teams, we have now received funding for additional accommodation for prison leavers in 5 probation regions from June. And we recently received news that in fact that's now going to be expanded to the whole of England and Wales. So I think what that teaches me about leadership is never miss an opportunity in a crisis. We set up those homeless prevention teams in response to health concerns, but actually that's so important in terms of reducing reoffending. You cannot expect rehabilitation if people are street homeless. I've said it for as long as I can remember, but to actually see that now being translated into real cash so that we can ensure people have somewhere to live is really quite extraordinary. And finally, we are receiving additional money, or rather our health service is in England, to invest in drug treatment services for offenders, and to ensure that if people have been receiving drug treatment in prison, that we have a consistency of care when they return to community. So unification has been bright and positive, but now we have additional investment to ensure that our new unified service can be the best it can be. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, we continued to be the subject of inspection and audit. And in fact, as a senior leader, that was important because we had made some pretty radical decisions in response to the public health crisis. So to receive the feedback that you can see on this slide was actually really, really positive. Because what it demonstrated is that even with the personal pressures that my staff were under, they continued to focus on those that they supervised. So that for me was a good outcome amidst the chaos that we were working in. Next slide, please. So, lessons learned. I think it's always important as a senior leader that you take the opportunity to think about, well, we did that well, and I might have done that differently. We never know, do we, if infection rates are going to increase again, or if potentially we could see new lockdowns in the future, if a new strain were to emerge. I mean, thankfully, the vaccination programme in England and Wales has gone exceptionally well. So at the moment, hospitalisation is very low. But were we to see a return, what are the sorts of things I would look back on and say, I would do that, or I would do that differently? I think one of the things I think we did exceptionally well was, in fact, clear and consistent communication. So the fact that our gold command was issuing small bite-sized instructions to staff regularly enough that they would remember it, but not too much that people felt overloaded, did really work. We adapted well in terms of smarter working during the pandemic. And I think there's a lot that we will continue to do in terms of using Teams or Zoom for partnership meetings, for meetings with staff. We do clearly want to get back to some face-to-face, but I think we've shown that we can work very efficiently and make good decisions as senior leaders through virtual meetings. The homeless prevention teams and the importance of accommodation, absolutely, it's been one of the best wins, if there is such a thing, out of what has been a terrible set of circumstances. And finally, the importance of using data and science, which led decisions during the pandemic. So using the available information from our public health colleagues to inform decisions about how we laid our offices out, about when staff should return to work, all of that was important. Next slide, please. So I think I've covered most of this, but this is a summary of our future challenges. Leadership is always a challenge, particularly when you are at the top of an organisation. So our future challenges, as set out there, are building on the work we've done to unify the service and now really squeezing the benefits out of this new unification, improving the quality of our casework, developing our approaches to public protection and showing tangible evidence of reducing reoffending, either by way of people getting into employment, resolving their alcohol substance misuse. These are the things we absolutely want to show that we can do, and do it exceptionally well. We've got lots still to do in terms of our target operating model and fully implementing that. We need to secure the recruitment to meet future demand. We need to maximise the opportunities we've been given by our recent spending investment, and we need to maintain and continue to build stakeholder confidence in the work that we do. So these are our future challenges, but they fill me with excitement. It's an opportunity to promote our service and the benefit that it provides to our communities. And on that note, I will close. If the technology works well, you've just been listening to me as a recording, and hopefully I might be joining you in person when I can answer some questions. I hope that was informative. Thank you for listening.